18 April 1942. Tokyo, Japan Task Force, 16 USS Hornet CV, 8 USS Enterprise CV, 6 Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, Junior Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle Corps metric, launch point roughly 650 nautical miles east of Japan after doubling B-25B fuel capacity to 1141 gallons. Dawn breaks over Tokyo on 18 April 1942, and air raid sirens hesitate as twin-engine bombers North American B-25B Mitchells roar low over the capital. 16 aircraft, each carrying 4 500-pound bombs, thread through factory districts and dockyards so low that office windows rattle before observers understand what they are seeing. Japanese planners, confident in the empire's new Pacific perimeter, had not imagined medium bombers over the home islands so early in the war. No known enemy airbase lies close enough to launch these aircraft, yet they are here skimming rooftops. Slowly, officers and civilians alike face the impossible conclusion these Army bombers have launched from a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier USS Hornet CV-8, somewhere out in the Pacific. The paradox sits at the heart of the raid. In early 1942, Japanese officers studying maps of the Pacific saw Tokyo as shielded by distant submarines, patrol aircraft, and picket boats. Carriers in their doctrine were instruments of fleet battle, not floating runways for twin-engine bombers. The U.S. Navy and U.S. Army Air Forces have quietly rewritten that rule. Task Force Sexton, under Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr., pairs Hornet's crowded flight deck with Enterprise's fighter cover, pushing Doolittle's bombers to the edge of the home islands. The question hangs over every move at sea and in the air. How did American planners turn geography into an advantage and expose blind spots in Tokyo's defenses? Step back to the first months of 1942. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japan's empire surges outward, seizing the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. A defensive arc stretches across the western Pacific, and Tokyo appears far beyond reach. From Hawaii, the Japanese capital lies nearly 3,800 miles away, far outside the radius of any land-based American bomber. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt demands a blow against the home islands, both to lift American morale and to prove that distance will not guarantee safety. Japanese planners quietly assume that no serious attack can reach Tokyo until enemy fleets batter their way through that outer ring. In January 1942, Captain Francis S. Lowe, serving on Admiral Ernest J. King's staff, watches twin-engine bombers practicing over a runway painted with the outline of a carrier deck. He suggests the unorthodox idea of launching Army bombers from a Navy carrier. The concept moves up the chain to General Henry H. Arnold, who selects Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle to design and lead the mission. The plan is stark in its simplicity and risk: load 16 B-25B Mitchells aboard Hornet, steam them to a launch point east of Japan, hit targets in Tokyo and other cities, then continue west to airfields in China. Two precious fleet carriers, Hornet and Enterprise with their escorts, must push deep into waters patrolled by Japanese forces. If they are found and sunk, U.S. carrier strength in the Pacific will be gutted. The B-25B is chosen for its combination of payload ruggedness and short takeoff performance. Crews from the 17th Bombardment Group drill at Eglin Field, Florida, learning to lift off in a few hundred feet and to fly low over water for hours. Technicians strip out some defensive guns to save weight and install extra fuel tanks in bomb bays and fuselage, increasing total capacity to more than 1,100 gallons, and giving the Mitchells a fighting chance to fly from a point east of Japan across the home islands and on toward China. On 1 April 1942, the modified bombers are craned onto Hornet's deck at Alameda, California, lashed down in two tight rows. On 2 April, Hornet sails west and joins Enterprise at sea, forming Task Force 16 under Halsey's command, with a planned launch point about 480 nautical miles from Japan. Japanese defenses depend on early warning from a ring of picket boats scattered across the approaches to the home islands. One of them, Guard Boat No. 23, Nito Maru, a converted fishing vessel, is on station on the morning of 18 April. At 0738, roughly 650 nautical miles east of Japan, her lookouts spot the American task force and radio, a contact report toward the mainland. U.S. Ships move to silence her, but the warning is already in motion. Aboard Hornet and Enterprise, Halsey and Doolittle weigh their options. Turning back would waste the operation. Closing the range would invite air attack and submarine contact. They choose to launch immediately, nearly 170 nautical miles farther out than planned. The 16B, 25Bs, loaded with bombs and fuel, now must fly off a short heaving deck into marginal weather, then cross Japan and stretch every gallon to reach friendly fields in China. 18 April 1009, 142, Pacific Ocean, USS Hornet CV, 8 Task Force, 16 Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, Junior Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle Core metric B-25B takeoff distance about 467 feet with full load. On Hornet's flight deck, waves slam against the bow as the carrier steams into heavy seas, squeezing every knot of wind over the deck for takeoff. At 0820 on 18 April 1942, Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle lines up his B-25B Mitchell at the deck's forward edge engines at full power. The bomber, loaded with 4 500-pound bombs and fitted with extra fuel tanks, has only a few hundred feet of wooden planking ahead of it. It surges forward, wheels rumbling over tie-down points, drops toward the gray Pacific, then claws into the air and begins to climb. 15 more B-25Bs follow, one after another, launching by 0919. No American crew has ever flown a medium bomber from a carrier deck before. Yet, all 16 aircraft, carrying 80 airmen, get airborne without loss, turning west toward Japan, roughly 650 nautical miles away. Japanese commanders alerted when guard boat No. 23 Nitomaru radios a contact report, struggle to interpret the threat. Picket boat messages confirm an enemy task force far out at sea, but the notion that these ships might be launching twin-engine army bombers does not register. Carrier doctrine in Tokyo still centers on fleet actions and naval aircraft, not medium bombers, striking the home islands. Pilots and staff officers argue over sketchy reports of American carriers 650 miles offshore, but they do not expect a raid on the capital that same day. In Tokyo, air defenses remain on a normal footing, confident that the empire's expanded perimeter has pushed serious danger far from the home islands. The American decision to launch early to keep Task Force 16 out of range of massed counterattacks quietly exploits this doctrinal blind spot. The B-25Bs, flying low over the Pacific, burn through their fuel as they push toward Japan. Extra tanks in the bomb bay crawlways and fuselage boost each aircraft's fuel load to more than 1,100 gallons, enough on paper to carry them from the emergency launch point across the home islands and on toward China. The early launch, however, cuts into that margin. Pilots hold strict courses by dead reckoning, checking headings against the waves and occasional breaks in the overcast. Some defensive guns have been removed to save weight, but the Mitchells still carry their bomb loads, relying on low-altitude surprise and speed rather than heavy armament. Cloud cover over the Pacific helps conceal the formation as it closes the coast. Then the crews separate, each pair or flight angling toward assigned targets in Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, or Kobe. Over Tokyo, civilians and soldiers alike look up in confusion as the first B-25Bs thunder over rooftops through broken cloud. Sirens begin to wail only after the aircraft are already overhead. Crews attack power stations, dockyards, oil facilities, and military installations, some bombing from around 1200 to 1500 feet, others staying lower to reduce their time in flak. 4 500-pound bombs from each aircraft fall across industrial zones and nearby neighborhoods, starting fires and damaging infrastructure. Anti-aircraft batteries answer, but their fire is scattered and late. The raid's shock rests on this timing and method. Japanese planners had assumed that only land-based bombers from fixed bases could threaten Tokyo, and that no American airfield lay close enough to make such a strike possible in early 1942. By using a carrier as a one-time launch platform for Army bombers, the United States quietly breaks the range calculations that underpin that confidence. As the bombers swing southwest toward China, fuel gauges edge toward empty. The extra distance from the early launch forces crews to recheck every estimate. Weather worsens over the Zhejiang and Jiangxi interior clouds, dropping to obscure valleys and fields. Most crews never see their intended airstrips. One after another, they bail out into darkness or crash land in rice paddies and hillsides, abandoning aircraft to save lives. Chinese civilians, soldiers, and guerrillas move in, despite the risk of Japanese reprisals, hiding airmen guiding them through villages and mountains toward friendly lines. 1B, 25B, critically short of fuel and unable to reach China, diverts north to the Soviet Far East. It lands near Vladivostok, where the crew is interned under Moscow's neutrality policy. The human cost becomes clear in the weeks that follow. 80 airmen launched from Hornet. Several die in crashes and bailouts. 8 fall into Japanese hands. After a show trial in Shanghai, 3 are executed by firing squad. 1 dies in prison from disease and mistreatment, and 4 endure harsh captivity until the war's end in 1945. Doolittle himself, after bailing out over China, initially believes the mission has failed because every aircraft is lost. Instead, news of the raid races through the United States and across the Pacific. For Americans, it proves that the home islands are vulnerable and that the U.S. Navy's carriers can reach farther than Japanese planners believed. For Japan's naval leadership, it forces a reassessment of home defense and carrier employment, helping to push them toward the Midway operation that will follow. Task Force 16. Its carriers undamaged turns back across the Pacific, having demonstrated in a single morning that Japanese assumptions about distance carriers and the safety of Tokyo were wrong, and that an American carrier could indeed send bombers over the capital. 18 April 1942, Tokyo, Japan, and beyond. Task Force 16 Imperial Japanese Forces, Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr., Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Core Metric B, 25B. Fuel capacity increased from 646 to 1141 gallons for a one-way strike over Japan toward China. The Doolittle Raid's bombs fall on Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe, igniting oil tanks and scarring military depots, but the physical damage remains modest. Factories and dockyards, though hit resume, work quickly. Japan's war production in April 1942 barely pauses. The psychological effect, however, cuts deep. Japanese leaders, stunned, confirm that American bombers have struck the home islands, a fact impossible to hide. Civilians, long assured that the empire's heart was beyond reach, begin to doubt that promise of safety. The Imperial Navy's assumption that distance and patrol lines alone would shield Tokyo collapses in a single morning. Japanese commanders scramble to reassess their defensive posture. The raid proves that a carrier can serve as a launch platform for medium bombers, a tactic that had not figured in pre-war planning. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto at Combined Fleet faces demands to protect the home islands as well as sustain the Empire's outward drive. The home islands, treated as a secure rear area, now require permanent air and naval cover. 4 Army fighter groups are retained in Japan through 1942 and into 1943, tying down valuable pilots and aircraft that might otherwise have fought over the Solomons or New Guinea. Resources shifted to radar search operations and home defense coordination add further strain to Japan's already stretched offensive plans. In the United States, news of the raid jolts a public still reeling from early defeats. President Franklin D. Roosevelt determined to conceal the carrier's roll jokes to reporters that the bombers came from Shangri-La, a fictional mountain refuge. The morale surge is real. Newspapers celebrate the strike on Tokyo, and confidence in the Navy and Army Air Forces rises. Strategically, the raid demonstrates that carriers can project land-based bombers when properly modified and handled. Task Force 16's return, with Hornet and Enterprise undamaged, preserves the core of U.S. carrier strength for the battles to come. Japanese picket boats, including Nito Maru, had sighted and reported the task force around 650 nautical miles from Japan, but could not prevent the launch that followed. Japanese planners have misread American intent and capacity. Their defensive perimeter, built on distance and scattered patrols, assumed no enemy carrier would risk deep penetration toward the home islands. The raid's most painful lesson is not tonnage lost, but doctrine overturned. American carriers launched bombers nearly 200 nautical miles farther from Japan than U.S. planners had originally intended and still sent them over Tokyo. In China, The political and human costs multiply. From May to September 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army's Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign targets airfields and regions suspected of aiding the raiders. Villages are burned, executions carried out, and biological agents such as plague and cholera are released by units, including Unit 731. An estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians die through massacre, disease, and famine. The campaign, meant to deter future raids, also sickens Japanese troops and hardens Chinese resistance. The raid's human toll among the aircrews lingers. Of the 80 men who launch from Hornet, several die in crashes and bailouts as they reach China. 8 are captured by Japanese forces. After a show trial in Shanghai, 3 are executed. 1 dies in prison from disease and mistreatment, and 4 survive years of harsh captivity until 1945. Doolittle, convinced at first that the mission has failed, because all 16B, 25Bs are lost, expects reprimand. Instead, he receives the Medal of Honor and promotion, and the surviving raiders become symbols of resolve on the American home front. In Japan, the same raid forces a strategic pivot. Yamamoto accelerates plans for an operation against Midway Atoll, seeking to destroy the U.S. carrier force that had brought bombers within range of Tokyo. 2 months later, at Midway, Japan loses 4 fleet carriers, a blow that permanently shifts the balance in the Pacific. The raid's legacy stretches beyond its immediate damage. It stands as a proof of concept for joint Army-Navy operations, with Hornet's short deck, sending Army bombers toward Japan from roughly 650 nautical miles offshore. American planners note that the material effect was limited, but the disruption to Japanese confidence and resource allocation was significant. Critics continue to debate the risk of committing 2 precious carriers for such modest physical results. Yet the core lesson endures: carriers can overturn assumptions of sanctuary, forcing an enemy to defend what it believed untouchable. In April 1942, Japan's belief in an unassailable homeland is shattered, and the trajectory of the Pacific War bends in response. The Doolittle Raid, launched on 18 April 1942, redefines naval warfare by proving that aircraft carriers can project medium bombers deep into enemy territory. 16 North American B-25B Mitchells roar off USS Hornet's short flight deck, using roughly 500 feet of runway, 650 nautical miles from Japan, a distance Japanese planners had assumed only land-based bombers could cover. Each aircraft, modified with extra fuel tanks in bomb bay and fuselage, now carries enough fuel to strike Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe, and then attempt to reach airfields in China. The Imperial Japanese Navy, fixated on carriers as platforms for naval fighters and dive bombers in fleet battles, never foresaw this tactical leap. The raid's audacity, mating Army medium bombers with a Navy carrier, exploits a blind spot at the core of Japan's defensive calculus. On Hornet's deck, crews fight heavy seas and gusting wind to position the B-25Bs, each loaded with 4 500-pound bombs and fuel for the long one-way mission. The task force is spotted early when guardboat No. 23 Nitomaru radios a sighting at 0738, forcing an immediate launch from far out at sea, well beyond the originally planned distance from Japan's coast. The earlier launch lengthens the flight and tightens fuel margins, but turning back would waste the operation and risk the carriers to further detection. Japanese commanders receiving Nitomaru's report scramble to understand the threat. Their picket boat system was designed to warn of surface fleets approaching the home islands. It was never configured to stop Army bombers already committed to flight. The B-25Bs, flying low over the Pacific to avoid patrols, press on toward the Japanese coast. The raid's execution hinges on precise preparation. Weeks of training at Eglin Field, Florida, teach the crews short field takeoffs, low-level approach profiles, and strict fuel discipline. The B-25B's successful launch from Hornet's crowded deck under combat load proves the aircraft's versatility and the feasibility of the concept. Over Tokyo and other cities, the bombers weave through broken cloud and scattered flak, attacking industrial and military targets, tank farms, factories, dockyards, and military facilities. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries, unprepared for a daylight raid by medium bombers, react late and unevenly. The surprise rests on Japan's miscalculation. Planners assumed that no American base lay close enough to support such an attack in early 1942. Hornet's mobility nullifies that assumption, delivering bombers from the sea where land-based aircraft could not yet reach. The tactical innovation reverberates beyond the explosions themselves. The raid shows that carriers can extend strike ranges far past the envelope of their own organic air wings by hosting land-based bombers for special operations. Shocked by the breach of their perceived sanctuary, Japanese leaders divert scarce resources to home defense. 4 army fighter groups are retained in the home islands through 1942 and into 1943, tying down pilots, aircraft, and fuel that might otherwise have supported operations at Guadalcanal and in New Guinea. The U.S. Navy studying the raid refines carrier task force doctrine around speed, concentrated striking power, and surprise, while Japanese planners confront the weaknesses of an early warning system that relies heavily on picket boats and limited radar coverage. The human element underlines the gamble behind the innovation. 80 airmen, none of them with prior carrier takeoff experience, commit to a mission they know will not end back on Hornet. Most crash land or bail out over China when fuel runs low, and weather obscures planned airfields depending on Chinese civilians and guerrillas for rescue and shelter. 8 fall into Japanese hands, 3 are executed after a show trial, 1 dies in captivity, and 4 endure years in prison camps. Yet in strategic terms, the raid succeeds as proof of concept. Task Force 16, with Hornet and Enterprise intact, withdraws eastward, escaping Japanese counterstroke. The central lesson is unmistakable on both sides of the Pacific. An American carrier has launched bombers against Tokyo, and Japan's assumption that distance alone would protect its capital has been shattered. The Doolittle Raid shatters Japan's illusion of an untouchable homeland, helping drive a strategic pivot that ends in disaster at Midway. Before April 1942, Japanese planners treated Tokyo as effectively safe behind a vast Pacific barrier of distant submarines, aircraft, and picket boats. The raid launched from USS Hornet after short takeoff runs of roughly 500 feet on her flight deck proves that carriers can project medium bombers without warning, delivering 16 B-25Bs over Japan's capital. This revelation shocks Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and strengthens his push to extend Japan's defensive line eastward by seizing Midway Atoll, aiming to lure U.S. carriers into a decisive battle. The raid's psychological impact is immediate. Japanese civilians, assured after Pearl Harbor that the home islands lay beyond enemy reach, now see American bombers over Tokyo. The government, unable to hide the attack, faces shaken public confidence. Militarily, the raid exposes gaps in Japan's early warning system. Picket boats like Nitomaru detect Task Force 16 about 650 nautical miles from Japan, but warning alone cannot stop bombers once they are airborne. Japan's limited radar network and scattered patrols fail to prevent the strike. The inability to stop the low-flying B-25Bs forces Japan to retain 4 fighter groups in the home islands, weakening offensive air strength in the South Pacific. Yamamoto's response, amplified by the raid's exposure of home front vulnerabilities, accelerates plans for Midway. The June 1942 battle, designed to destroy the remaining U.S. carriers, instead becomes a catastrophe. Japan loses 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of trained crew, ceding the strategic initiative in the Pacific. The Doolittle Raid, though modest in physical damage, is one of the factors that pushes Japanese high command toward this risky operation. Its short-run takeoffs from Hornet showcase carrier flexibility and encourage U.S. planners to double down on fast, self-contained task forces. Japan already stretched diverts, ships, and fuel to bolster home defense, further straining its ability to sustain distant conquests. In China, the raid's fallout is grim. Japan's Zhejiangjiangxi campaign, launched to destroy airfields and punish civilians who aided the raiders, kills an estimated 2,500 people between May and September 1942, while Unit 731's biological attacks spread disease that also afflicts Japanese troops. The campaign, intended to deter future raids, instead deepens Chinese resistance and adds to Japan's overextension. The raid's strategic weight lies in this disruption. Once forced to guard its own skies, Japan can no longer expand across the Pacific with confidence. The myth of an unassailable Tokyo collapses, proving that distance and doctrine alone cannot shield an empire from a carrier that can launch bombers at its capital. The Doolittle Raid, a single strike on 18 April 1942, reshapes naval warfare and leaves a lasting legacy. Launching 16B, 25B Mitchells from USS Hornet, about 650 nautical miles from Japan, proves that carriers can project land-based bombers far beyond the reach of existing American bases, striking an enemy capital directly from the sea. The concept first suggested by Captain Francis S. Lowe and brought to life under Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle's leadership quietly rewrites U.S. strategy. The Joint Army-Navy model tested on Hornet's crowded flight deck, with short takeoff runs of roughly 500 feet, becomes a precursor to the fast carrier task forces that will drive American offensives from the Solomon Islands to Iwo Jima. The human toll endures in memory. Of 80 airmen who launched from Hornet 69, ultimately survived the mission, most evading capture in China with the help of civilians and guerrillas. 8 are taken prisoner, 3 are executed after a show trial, 1 dies in prison from disease and mistreatment, and 4 endure captivity until 1945. Doolittle, initially convinced that losing all 16B, 25 seconds means failure, instead receives the Medal of Honor and a promotion. In the United States, the raid's morale impact is amplified by President Franklin D. Roosevelt's playful claim that the bombers came from Shangri-La, turning a classified origin into a symbol of ingenuity and resolve. In China, Japanese reprisals during the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign, which are often estimated to have killed around 25,000 civilians, fix the raid's tragic cost in local memory and deepen anti-Japanese sentiment. Japan's strategic responses, shaped in part by the shock of the raid, prove costly. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan for Midway, given new urgency by the realization that American carriers can bring bombers over Tokyo, is intended to destroy the remaining U.S. flat tops. Instead, the June 1942 battle cost Japan 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of irreplaceable crew, shifting the strategic balance in the Pacific. The raid exposes the limits of a defensive perimeter built on distance and scattered patrols. Once American carriers demonstrate they can strike from far offshore, Japan must guard its own skies. Fighter groups and ships that might have supported offensives in the South Pacific are retained for home defense, and by 1943, Japan's initiative begins to fade as its resources are stretched thin. In military history, the Doolittle Raid stands as a turning point. Its tactical surprise, launching medium bombers from a carrier on a one-way mission across the mid-Pacific to targets over Tokyo and on toward China, reveals how fragile geographic assumptions can be. U.S. carriers, once viewed primarily as fleet support, emerge as strategic linchpins whose designs and doctrine evolve to support long-range multi-role operations. The raid's legacy, etched in the survival of 69 raiders and the sacrifice of Chinese civilians, underscores both the power and the cost of innovation. A single day's strike proves that audacity and engineering can reach into what an enemy believes to be its safest space, and that even a distant capital is not beyond the range of a carrier-borne attack.